interested in the market and just pretty much any kind of form of alternative medicine that's possible. It's a new and upcoming field, and strong proponent. Thanks for having me here.
Good to see you, Alan. Bo, you're up.
Hey, Bo Huck, Porzio Bromberg and Newman, Porzio Governmental Affairs. Kind of fell into this for all sorts of different reasons. Worked for the legislature for 7 years, worked on medical marijuana legislation, and from there kind of hopped over to this. So you guys, by the way, hear screaming in the background, or have that kid on screen at any point, just had a newborn and trying to wrangle the two now. Yeah. Totally different animal.
I thought those were your clients. Never mind. Ron, you're up.
Hello, everybody. And hey, Kathryn, it's nice to meet you. Guy says you're a big shot, so you must be. So I've been practicing as a solo practitioner for about 30 years. I predominantly represent municipalities, mayors, council folks, governing bodies, that sort of thing. Plus, I've always represented various zoning and planning boards. In this space, I typically represent municipalities. I represented Atlantic City in the cannabis field, Hoboken, Jersey City, Maywood, and just recently been asked by about 24 other municipalities to come in. And unlike the MSOs and some of the other cannabis establishments, I come in with a very neutral, just purely educational presentation. My first line is, I don't know if cannabis is appropriate for Chester. And everybody's ears sort of perks up and that sort of thing. So the last 2 weeks, I think I got another dozen municipalities that are interested in the seminar. So nice to see everybody. And oh, one last thing. I do represent a group that is, they have several rehabilitation centers. And one of them, I do believe, is going to be very large in Bergen County. And they have an interest in this down the road for potential, treatment to folks that are addicted to opiates, et cetera, et cetera. Thanks.
David, why don't you go ahead? You're muted, David.
Can you not hear me?
Now I can.
There you go. Hi, Kathryn. My name is David White. I have the privilege to serve alongside Dan, Ron, and Joe on the New Jersey State Bar Association Cannabis Law Special Committee, where I co-chair the Labor and Employment Committee. My background is an interest in public policy in the cannabis space, and I'm intrigued by the work that these folks have been doing in the psychedelic space. Thank you for coming here today.
Ronald?
So what I would suggest, Dan, is
I'm sorry, that's you. I apologize. Guy, go ahead.
Get rid of that.
Yeah, go ahead, Guy, and then we'll let Kathryn take over.
Thank you, Dan. So Gaetano Lardiri from Newark, New Jersey. I spent 26 years, well, 44 years in the medical field, but 26 years in cancer research, running global cancer clinical trials all over the world for all the big pharmaceutical companies. In 2014, got into cannabis space, and now the last year, taking a deep dive into the psychedelics. I've made a lot of very interesting contacts all over the world in psychedelics. Met Kathryn a while back in the RTT group with her. That's where I met Kathryn. And yeah, that's basically it. And now we're doing an event on November 12th with Stockton University, where we're going to have speakers and pre-recorded talks. So I'm inviting everyone here. I'll give a free link to that. Just please email me, because I'm still working out the codes with Stockton University, and I'll make sure everyone gets a free link to that for that event. So thank you, Kathryn, for taking the invite and speaking with us today. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Guy. And John, you made it in just under the wire. We're going to let you do a little intro on yourself to Kathryn, and then we're gonna kick off the presentation in earnest. So go ahead, John. Or not. Maybe John's just going to lurk. All right. So Kathryn, why don't we let you take over? And again, very appreciative of your time. I know you're busy. I know you have slides, which hopefully you're going to be able to control yourself.
Let me see if I can screen share. And
there you go. I see it.
Okay, beautiful.
Okay.
Yeah, so thanks for the invite, and I will try to tick through these pretty quickly. Let me just go back in case anyone wants to capture my email. Feel free to follow up if I don't touch on something of interest. There's my email. I've very recently moved my work to the National Psychedelics Association. It's a brand new organization that is still kind of standing itself up, but it seems like a good place from which to do the work that I'm doing that I'll talk a little bit about with you today. But just to introduce myself to everyone, I come into this work after a really pretty long career that was focused on advocacy to protect and expand the rights of terminally ill patients. And over, 35 years, that involved a lot of different things, including advocacy to ensure that dying patients receive aggressive pain and symptom management, that they're able to access really quite aggressive interventions like palliative sedation, which I'll talk about a little bit, and what is sometimes called death with dignity, but more often referred to as aid in dying. I was really in the front lines of that work with the nation's first ballot in 1991 in Washington to enact a death with dignity law. I was the campaign counsel. We came within shouting distance of passing that, and then went on to succeed in Oregon a couple of years later in 1994 with the nation's first initiative measure that passed into law, allowing dying patients the option of aid in dying. And that work then went on to also involve defense of that act, which has some modern day significance in the psychedelic litigation that I'll be talking about. So some of you may remember the case of Oregon et al. Versus Ashcroft Gonzalez, and I'll have a chance to talk about that a little bit later. So I started, my interest in psychedelic medicine, and in particular psilocybin, because it is a new tool that fills a notable gap in the palliative care toolbox, and that is to relieve non-physical suffering. And that's really important. This, for those of you who don't work in the arena of end-of-life care, the reality is, for all of the wonderful benefits of modern medicine, the kind of difficult reality is no one very much dies quickly anymore. And for many patients, death can be very protracted. The dying process can be very protracted. And that can bring considerable non-physical suffering, anxiety, and depression. So, much of the work of my career did see measures to improve relief of physical suffering, and we've made a lot of progress. It is now standard of care and really mandatory to address physical suffering. Failure to do so is actionable, but there hasn't been a great tool for relief of non-physical suffering until we started to see these really compelling recent findings about the efficacy of psilocybin to reduce anxiety and depression in this population. And so I've got a few slides here. The literature is really worth looking at. It's quite compelling. These studies come out of leading universities, UCLA, Johns Hopkins, finding that when patients with advanced illness have even a single psychotherapy assisted session with psilocybin, they have really remarkable relief, immediate, substantial, and sustained relief. And that's, quite unusual to have one treatment with such profound beneficial effect. So when I started to see these studies, I got excited about opening access. I like to share this site because this is a recent landscape overview of all of the many studies of a variety of different psychedelics that have been in the modern era of research, and it's a comprehensive and really useful overview. I also like to remind people that we do allow patients with advanced illness to choose to ingest controlled substances in the course of end-of-life care to eradicate consciousness, and that's the intervention known as palliative sedation. That intervention is for patients who have physical suffering that is not responding to conventional therapy. And they are able to invite a clinician to induce complete unconsciousness and withhold food and fluid until death arrives. We also allow an increasingly large number of terminally ill people across the country to choose death with dignity, aid in dying. And many states now have followed in Oregon's footsteps and make that option available. And I like to say, well, if we allow ingestion of controlled substances to eradicate consciousness and or to precipitate death, why shouldn't there be access of a controlled substance to elevate and expand consciousness, which is what psychedelics do? And a really interesting question then arises about whether people who think they might want to choose aid in dying or another aggressive end-of-life option would have that choice impacted by psilocybin-assisted therapy. We don't know yet. There's no data bearing on that. It's certainly something that could be studied with implementation of the Oregon Psilocybin Services Act, which will be happening in a few months. So that's a really interesting study question to watch. So as you probably all know, and we're mostly all lawyers here, psilocybin and other psychedelic substances sit on Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act, which means, you know, it's the most strictly regulated and deemed to have no accepted medical use in treatment. So I've kind of given a number of ways that access could open, and the obvious main avenue to reform is to take psilocybin and or other psychedelics off of Schedule 1 and reschedule them. We do have a rescheduling petition pending with the DEA. We filed it in February, first ever rescheduling petition for psilocybin that we're aware of. And of course, the ongoing clinical trials are directed at coming to completion and seeing rescheduling flow as a downstream event. So that's kind of a main avenue to reform. There's some limited ability to stay in the FDA sandbox and gain access through the FDA expanded access program. I won't talk much about that. There's been plenty of criticism of that as an avenue to access. There is, as you know, an ongoing burgeoning interest in the states, including, Oregon as the pioneering state to adopt a legal regime. And now, of course, other states are trying to follow in those footsteps. Whether we will see a cooperative federalism approach emerge is yet to be determined. We do not know if the federal government will choose to refrain from pursuing sanction under federal law when states legalize and regulate. That's a question mark. And then another avenue that I will kind of focus some discussion on is an avenue that I'm exploring, which is using right to try laws to open access. So as mentioned, the Oregon law, yet again, another pioneering initiative-driven enactment in the state of Oregon. Federal response uncertain. And what's also uncertain is we don't know how even state authorities in Oregon, those who license physicians and other healing professionals, whether they will consider licensure sanction, et cetera. So we don't know that. We've had a lot of discussion within the National Psychedelics Association about being prepared to defend those professionals should that emerge. So, absent a federal safe harbor, even if a state like Oregon or perhaps next New Jersey succeeds in enacting a state law, without a federal safe harbor, there are going to be barriers to participation. And particularly the population that I focus on, which is people with advanced illness. These are medically and pharmacologically complicated patients. You probably would hope that that patient would have their therapy overseen by a highly trained physician who understands their medical condition and all of the big pharma that they may be on. And yet, when there's not a federal safe harbor, you have the problem that physicians are DEA registrants and they can't put their DEA registration at risk. And you also have the reality that most people that are receiving end-of-life care are receiving it through the hospice benefit, which is a federal Medicare benefit. And that's not possible when there's not a federal safe harbor. And hence my interest in utilizing state and federal right to try laws to establish both state and federal safe harbor. So what the heck are these laws? These laws recognize that some otherwise prohibited drugs are to be accessible in certain situations for certain populations. These laws swept the country in a firestorm between the first enactment in Colorado in 2014 and 2020. 41 states adopted state statutes that establish this right. And that's a very fast, a very rapid rate of adoption. And the federal government adopted a federal right to try, the federal Congress, in 2018. And I've given you the site to the federal statute, the USC code, and to the RCW, the Washington statute, because our advocacy effort arises in the state of Washington. So these are the criteria for the patient to be eligible. The federal statute uses the language life-threatening, which, you know, for those who appreciate the significance of words, that's obviously a broader term than terminally ill. And it could certainly encompass people at risk of suicide, for example, veterans with PTSD, as we know, something on the order of 20 per day, veteran suicides from unrelieved PTSD. So they could be deemed eligible patients, and certainly patients with terminal illness as well. They must have exhausted other treatment options, be unable to participate in a clinical trial, and sign a rather elaborate informed consent, because of course what we're talking about are investigational drugs. So that seems appropriate. Well, what is an eligible investigational drug? These are the simple criteria, and that is true for psilocybin. It is also true for another psychedelic, MDMA. Those both have completed an FDA phase 1 clinical trial, not yet licensed or approved, and remain under investigation. You might ask yourself, well, are Schedule 1 substances within the reach of RTT? And the argument that we advance in our case is yes, of course. And the reason why we know this is that some of the states, as the many states were considering enactment, included specific carve-outs. And I've given you the example of Missouri, and this is what such a carve-out looks like. Legislative drafters know how to exclude when they want to, and Missouri did so, but there is no such exclusion in the Washington statute, nor the vast majority of the state enactments, nor in the federal enactment. So this case you may have heard about, and if you haven't, you might like to learn about it. It's a pretty interesting advocacy effort. I represent the Advanced Integrative Medical Science Institute, known as AIMS, which is based in Seattle. It's an integrative oncology clinic, and its palliative care director, Dr. Sunil Agarwal, and a number of Dr. Agarwal's patients who have advanced cancer. And that clinic already does provide ketamine-assisted therapy, which is a kind of a cutting-edge effort to address anxiety and depression in dying patients. It sits on Schedule 3, so it doesn't face the same barrier to access. And yet Dr. Agarwal believes his patients would benefit from psilocybin therapy. And so we approached the DEA to find out how it was going to accommodate the law of the land, these right to try laws. And the DEA refused. And so we went into the Ninth Circuit. There's a direct jurisdiction in the Ninth Circuit. Do not need to stop at district court or start in district court. You just go straight into the Ninth Circuit. And we had a year of litigation. In that time, we were joined by many amici, and this is, quite an interesting array of amici. I share it with you not only because it's really interesting who came in. All of these are on the side supporting petitioners who I represent, including, the unusual, unlikely having Cato and the ACLU on the same side in a case, and seeing so many states come in to stand up for their state statutes and to oppose the federal DEA agency from essentially usurping state authority to regulate the practice of medicine. And then we saw lots of others as well, end-of-life advocates, some of the leading researchers, including Roland Griffiths, who's led the modern era research at Johns Hopkins. A really interesting and robust participation, and there will be another round of amicus participation coming up soon. So put out some antenna as to whether you have clients who have voices that merit amicus participation. So the petitioners argued essentially as follows. RTT is the law of the land. Since I'm here among lawyers, I'll do the little bit of drill down into those deep weeds that lawyers love. The right to try is an amendment of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, the FDCA, which is largely implemented by the FDA. The Controlled Substances Act is a different federal statute. It's largely implemented by the DEA. And the CSA, within its own statute in section 902, has a provision that says nothing in the CSA shall be read to override the FDCA. So it looks clear that the federal Congress has determined how, when there's an apparent tension or conflict between the CSA and the FDCA, that the CSA cannot override. In addition, the DEA's scope of authority is limited, as all federal agencies are, and it is to effectuate controls against diversion, and it is not empowered to make determinations regarding the practice of medicine. And as mentioned earlier, in this case known as Gonzalez versus Oregon, which some of you may remember when Attorney General John Ashcroft was the AG, he was very offended by the fact that Oregon had empowered dying patients to choose a more peaceful death through aid in dying. And he tried to use his office as US Attorney General to nullify the Oregon Death with Dignity Act. And he issued a directive that said any physician complying with the Oregon enactment would face action under the CSA. And that was challenged in federal court. I represented the patient interveners. The state of Oregon stood up as well as the primary plaintiff. And we litigated that through every level of federal court. And we won at every level, including SCOTUS, which said the states are the primary regulators of the practice of medicine. And so that's an important precedent here. The DEA's position, we did circle around in that first round of litigation with a lot of discussion about whether the agency's determination was sufficiently final to open the courthouse doors. And as you know, agencies love to avoid review of their action by saying nothing to see here, no final agency action has actually happened. So, that was its primary argument in the first round of the Ames litigation. To the extent that the DEA presented a merits argument, it is this next bullet, which basically said, look, it's important to the war on drugs to prevent dying patients from accessing this drug. It was quite ridiculous. The Ninth Circuit, as most federal courts do when the agency argues no final agency action, punted the issue out of the courthouse and said, insufficiently final. So maybe the DEA hoped we would go away, but we immediately pivoted and filed two things: a request for a final agency action and a petition to reschedule. Interestingly, and we're quite, proud and pleased that Ames 1 catalyzed the introduction of a bipartisan, bicameral bill in the US Congress. And that it's called the Right to Try Clarification Act. And it is simply to clarify that Schedule I substances are within the ambit of RTT. This is also an opportunity for everyone to think about, do you have clients who would want to be alerted to this pending federal bill, who have voices that should be heard? The window is open for letters of support, and we've generated quite a few already. It's really important for federal legislators to know that their constituents are watching this and they would like to see prompt enactment of this bill. So yes, please see if you can engage some powerful voices in support to move this bill to enactment. We had a couple of different communications from the DEA on our request for final agency action. We got one at the end of June, and we thought it was sufficiently final that we raced back into court with a petition for review. And then in August, we got a letter that actually used the magic words, final agency action. And so we filed a petition for review based on the August 19 letter. We're now consolidating those, and we'll be back and are back to reach the merits. So this is another opportunity I'll flag for you for amicus participation. A really interesting development when that bipartisan bicameral bill was introduced. We saw a broad coalition of veterans step up and submit a letter to the federal legislators urging prompt enactment of the federal Right to Try Clarification Act. And the language of their letter that has really resonated and stayed with me is they said, in light of the high rate of PTSD among veterans and the fact that MDMA assisted therapy is so efficacious, many veterans are leaving the country they served to receive services with MDMA therapy in Jamaica and Peru and Mexico. And their words were, that is morally unacceptable. And that's really powerful. So it would be great to see the veterans come in and share that perspective as amici. There is a citizen activist website now that I share with you. Up on that website are sample letters to send to legislators. There's a petition. That website is updated with these model letters that I've mentioned to you. That group has, I believe, monthly Zoom calls. So for anyone really interested in following this Right to Try work, feel free to visit that website and post it to your circles and communities to really kind of build a grassroots support. So I'm going to kind of wrap up and then love to have discussion with you all, but just sharing that, there are a variety of efforts underway to open access to psychedelics. And these range from things like the effort to enact a bill in New Jersey. I just stopped in Denver on my way out to the East Coast. I'm now in New York for some other events. But I stopped in Denver to speak at a educational conference about an effort that's pending in Colorado. And Colorado will have an Oregon-style initiative measure on the ballot in a couple of weeks. So we've got these state efforts going on. We've got this federal effort going on, and lots of ways for attorneys to get involved. I am a founding board member of the Psychedelic Bar Association. If you don't know about it, I've given you the site, and it's kind of a place for attorneys that want to come in and practice in this arena to find their peer groups. And there are a number of different committees ranging from, you know, corporate practice to IP to litigation to ethics that have meetings and do important work. The Psychedelic Bar is always encouraging everyone to practice in this arena under the rubric of the set of very high ethical standards set forth in the North Star Pledge. And if you don't know about it, I've given you the site to it. It's worth taking a look. It's a very high ethical level of practice. So with that, I'll stop the sharing of the screen and just kind of open it up to any discussion that might be of interest.
Yeah, really appreciate it, Kathryn. That's a great overview. Thank you. And thank you for your work in the space. I know that I probably speak for more than a few people on the call here, that when I started spinning up on psychedelics, like I said, about a year or so ago, I think I was Googling for about 6 minutes before I came across your name and what you were doing. So it's a thrill to have you address our group, which is a young group getting up on its feet, basically trying to figure out how we can take action on a variety of levels, legal level, non-legal, medical, research, advocacy. Basically, this group is a 360-degree, gathering of folks, not just attorneys. In fact, the attorneys on the call are probably outnumbered by the non-attorneys. God bless them. But we think there's a lot of strength to be gained from that. We get the perspectives of a lot of different people from a lot of different areas of practice and professional endeavor. And, to have a sort of signal to follow through the noise that, like you and what you're doing and what Emerge is doing, the Ames lawsuit, the petitions, et cetera, it's a true help, to a group like ours, trying to figure out, what we can do, what the opportunities are.
Yeah.
I don't have any particular questions myself. I certainly want to shut up and let other people talk, right? So to the extent that anybody wants to jump on in with a specific question or a general question, I think we have Kathryn for about another 20 minutes, which is great. So we'll try to get as many questions out and answered as we can. So let's try to be a little bit concise, and we'll see if we can go around the horn. Guy, I see you have your hand up, so go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kathryn. So from what I understand, the RTT isn't really just focusing on psilocybin. It's other drugs as well for end stage cancer. Is that correct? Can you speak a little bit on that?
Yeah, I mean, as one of the slides listed the criteria for a substance, for an investigational drug to be deemed an eligible investigational drug, it must have completed a phase 1 trial and not yet be approved and remain under investigation. And so you can tick those boxes with 2 psychedelic investigational drugs that I'm aware of at the moment, and that includes psilocybin and MDMA. So if we are successful with our effort to compel the DEA to open a path to access, and look, I mean, let's remember the DEA has a lot of tools in its toolbox. And if it, by its own volition or as mandated by a court or as prodded by the federal Congress, determines that it needs to open a pathway, it could do so in a whole bunch of different ways. It could issue waiver, it could issue exemption, it could issue exception, it could make a special registration for RTT purposes. And so, it really falls on the DEA's shoulders to determine which tool would be used. But we'd like to see it get busy taking one of those tools for the purpose of opening a path to access, which appears to be what the law requires.
Thank you.
Go ahead, John.
Hi, Kathryn. Thank you for your time. With regard to both treatment and the law, is there any distinction being made with psilocybin with regard to microdosing versus psychoactive levels?
Yeah, so, yeah, well, if you take a look, and it sounds like maybe you are a science nerd.
I just heard about microdosing, and I hear
Okay.
I hear it's quite ubiquitous in the black market in Manhattan and Silicon Valley.
So the clinical trials with patients with debilitating anxiety and depression in advanced illness, that is not microdosing. They're using a full-on dose. And if you take a look at the clinical trials, they will disclose the exact dose. So it's not microdosing. The clinical trials to date have been using synthetic psilocybin. So that would be the eligible investigational drug, synthetic form psilocybin. I am aware that a clinical trial is happening at UCSF now with a fungal psilocybin, not a synthetic. And when that clinical trial clears phase 1, and if it remains under investigation, it would become an eligible investigational drug. But those are not microdose amounts.
Do you see, is there any possibility for a distinction being made in the law? Because if it's microdosing, Schedule 1's illegal, so it doesn't matter if it's a little or a lot, unless it comes on board that way. Microdosing is not psychoactive. It's smaller dosage. It's not meant to be ingested in that way. Is it a way to open a door? Is anyone even thinking that way? I could be just even.
Well, yeah, any amount of that substance is a Schedule 1 controlled substance. So it is subject to the full panoply of potential prosecutorial sanction under state and or federal law. So yeah, you don't get out free because you have a smaller bid. I mean, the sentence might be lower.
I meant, is anyone thinking this way? And I normally wouldn't as an attorney, but in this being in cannabis for 5 years, I'm watching all my clients game the system. So you start thinking about incremental steps, you start thinking about workarounds, you start thinking about challenging the law because everyone's doing it. So why, I guess let's ask it rhetorically, why not come in and start with microdosing and see if they enforce in that regard? Because at that point, you're only worried about the combined weight of the psilocybin in the microdosing.
Well, maybe you'll take leadership in that. I mean, it
know.
certainly wouldn't be serving the population of people that I'm interested in serving. But there's plenty of room for other people to engage advocacy that serves something that they think advances their client's interest or a cause. I have no corner on that market.
It sounds like it's a recreational issue, maybe.
Hey, Kathryn, Joseph Shapiro here. So as Dan mentioned, we're co-chairing this subcommittee, and you already have experience running the Psychedelic Bar Association. Would you have any suggestions based on your experience founding that association, the best way to focus our efforts here in the subcommittee, especially since we're Jersey centric?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know. It's a lot of work to stand up a new organization. And if you are a section of the bar, you have the advantage of already having some structure. I know Oregon has now made the Oregon Bar Cannabis section is officially the Oregon Cannabis and Psychedelics section. And they just had their annual meeting and it was very well attended. And, there's a lot of, it seems as if most all cannabis firms now are eager to rebrand and extend their practice area to be cannabis and psychedelics. And there are a lot of reasons why, that makes sense, because those substances have all of the same Schedule 1 realities. And so lawyers who have been practicing in the cannabis space have a lot of knowledge to bring to bear on how do you run a business when it is federally prohibited. And so like the agenda for the Oregon Bar Association Cannabis and Psychedelics section, you might take a look at what they had on their agenda. Their conference was just 2 weeks ago. And they had a full range of really interesting discussions about, banking and insurance and tax reality, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of overlap in those fields. So you could take a look at that stuff. The Psychedelic Bar Association just held its first symposium. It was an all-day event, a lot of different topics and speakers. That agenda, you could just kind of take a look at, hey, what are the hot topics and what are people talking about, and away you go.
Great, thank you.
And Kathryn, let me jump in to kind of piggyback on what Joe is saying about following different leads of different organizations, Oregon and whatnot. I mean, one of the things we mentioned at the beginning here was that we formed our group shortly before Senator Scutari introduced his psilocybin bill, which came in June, I think it was. And of course, nothing much has happened over the summer, but the legislature's gearing up again, and we anticipate there's going to be discussion on it. So my question for you is, given your experience and knowledge about Oregon, and given that it seems that Senator Scutari's bill is modeled, at least to some degree, after the Oregon program, and it seems like a combination of that, and you see touches of our medicinal and even adult use cannabis programs in the psilocybin bill processes as well. Do you see anything, or would you recommend any thought processes about what is to be avoided in a new psilocybin bill, or what should absolutely be present in a bill, Senator Scutari's? Because we may be in a position to offer some stakeholder input.
No, I love that question. And having spent so many years in advocacy, where utilizing the initiative mechanism was important, because of course, let's remember, the direct democracy tool of the initiative process is designed to enable address of issues that are too hot for legislators to touch, right? And so that was true with Death with Dignity. Legislators didn't want to touch it for a long time. And the states that passed Death with Dignity laws in the early days were doing so through initiative, not traditional legislative process. And that was necessary because it wouldn't happen in the legislature. Having said that, the downside, there are noted downsides of the initiative process. And that includes the reality that you don't have the chance to amend and revise and refine a measure once it's crafted. The traditional legislative process, the sausage making of legislation, for all of the difficulty and challenge of it, it does accommodate refinement. So you're right. I mean, if you have a bill in the New Jersey legislature that's going through a traditional legislative process, it could be improved. And that's great. And so taking a careful look and considering what might be an improvement is well worth doing. One of the criticisms that I have of the Oregon bill is that it does not allow reasonable accommodation of people with disabilities, including people whose advanced terminal illness would make it difficult, if not impossible, for them to visit a service center. As you probably know, the Oregon model is not a dispensary model. Nobody goes to a dispensary and purchases a drug and takes it home. The model is modeled after the clinical trials the patient has, or the consumer, because of course the Oregon bill doesn't require any medical condition. It allows administration to healthy, normal people. But the model is that there would be a prep session, and then there would be an administration session at a service center, and then there would be one or more integration sessions. The service center is the only place in Oregon where service can be provided. So if you have a disabled or dying patient that would best receive service at home, there's no reasonable accommodation. And that's a discrimination against people with disabilities that is intolerable and impermissible. So I was glad to see that in the Oregon initiative, there is reasonable accommodation for that population to receive services at home. And I believe that's true in New Jersey as well. I can't recall off the top of my head. But these are the kinds of improvements that can be made when you are in a legislative process. And and you and your creative thinking may find other additional improvements.
Yeah, appreciate that. And I see a couple hands raised. Let me go to Bo. I know we have less than 10 minutes. Let me go to Bo and then Ron and then Guy, and that might finish out our hour here.
I apologize for jumping the line, guys. So something just to keep in the back of your heads as we kind of go forward with trying to figure out what's actually going to happen with this bill. The Democrats in this state are pretty much running scared because of what could happen with the federal cycle. No one's up for election this year, but everybody's up for election next year, both houses. So as things kind of progress at the state level with this bill, what's going to happen in November could really pull back the momentum of anything that's going on in this space. That just goes up. That goes for cannabis. That goes for everything. So it's just right now, there's going to be plenty of discussion on it, but legislators are very, very, very cautious about doing anything that could be perceived as impacting a federal election or for next year. So that's what I got. Thank you.
Yeah, no, good info, Bo. Appreciate it. Ron, go ahead.
All right, thanks. Thank you very much for that, Kathryn. I really appreciated that. In fact, I immediately signed up to the psilocybin bar. As you can tell, I'm a big proponent. But this is more of a comment. And I know Bo just mentioned the legislative momentum, but I'm involved with a lot of prosecutors, a lot of police officers. Nobody, and I mean nobody, is busting anybody for psilocybin, period, exclamation point. So although there may not be any legislative momentum, it went from a third-degree crime in New Jersey, which is 3 to 5 years, to a disorderly persons offense, which essentially is less than that. So I certainly have high hopes, and I know everybody here has high hopes as well. And once again, thanks so much.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I'll mention, and the reduction of penalty is very popular around the country right now with these decriminalized measures in a lot of different municipalities to reduce the potential penalty, which I think is partly what you were alluding to. One of the things that I would just flag that I have a niggling concern about is, as mentioned, under the Oregon model, and I think what we're going to see with states that follow, is it is quite heavily regulatory in that the service centers, must apply for licensure. And that kind of makes them sitting ducks should the federal enforcement desire be implemented. And if you take a look at what's just been going on in the federal courts around the safe injection house, the federal government has taken the position that regardless that the goal of a safe injection house is to prevent overdose, and that might be like a laudable public interest service, that those facilities will remain subject to federal prosecution. So there's not that much difference in some sense between a safe injection site and a psilocybin services center. So I do have a niggling concern that if the feds take a page from the safe injection litigation and approach and apply it to a state that is allowing the creation of psilocybin services centers, which, like, let's remember, what are they? They're centers where a Schedule I drug will be sold and ingested. Well, that's similar to the safe injection in the sense that those houses don't actually sell the drug. So they're kind of at even more modest risk, but they are where those drugs are to be administered or ingested. So I have a concern that there's going to be a potential federal engagement here that we don't yet know about. We just don't know.
Guy, why don't we let you bring it home here, and then we'll probably be at the end of our hour with Kathryn.
Yeah, With one of our most favorite topics here. So Kathryn, can you speak pros and cons too? Because I know here in New Jersey, people went up in arms. I said on a lot of other boards and advocacy groups about home grow because it's in the 2934 bill for mushrooms. And I know there's a lot of people here in New Jersey where they went up in arms because there's a lot of issues around cannabis home grow. So I don't know if you can give us some advice on that in the bill or other bills.
Well, again, Oregon is kind of out front, and what's the system in Oregon is that everyone is heavily regulated. And that's kind of what made the measure sellable to the voter, is that it sets up a quite heavily regulatory system. So everyone involved must apply for license from the Oregon Health Authority, and that includes the manufacturers who are the growers. And so manufacturers will be getting licenses, service centers will be getting licenses, and the facilitators will be getting licenses. So anyone, who wants to home grow will have to become a licensed manufacturer.
Thank you. And I think John had a last question. Is that correct? John, did you have a last question?
No, I thought that was
No,
it.
not at all.
Yeah,
Oh, okay. Sorry about that.
no, that's fine.
Yeah.
Let me wrap this up for us. Kathryn, really appreciate you talking to us. Really very, very valuable information, especially for a group like ours that is, got good momentum and hoping to maintain it. Again, a signal in the noise. That's really what you represent to me anyway, and to, I think, a lot of the folks on the call. I know we have your contact information. Appreciate that as well. If anybody has any questions for Kathryn, you can certainly reach out to me and I can connect you guys. You could try to connect directly. So don't be afraid. I mean, I think as in many new things like cannabis, like psychedelics, knowledge is key. The more knowledge you can gain from the more credible sources, the better. So with that, let me sign off for everybody. Kathryn, thank you very much again. Good luck with all your endeavors here on the East Coast.
Thanks so much.
And then good luck as you return back home, and we'll talk to you soon.
Dan, you can send the recording.
Thank you.
I'll take care of it.